We're live.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Miho Kim, your facilitator for the program today. I have the privilege of being a part of the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University. And on behalf of all of us presenting today, I want to extend to you our warmest welcome and blessing, and particularly the classes of Professor Yuki Obayashi and Eugene Gamble from our Asian American Studies Department. Thank you so much for joining us. This is actually a really special program today, the main purpose of which is Day of Remembrance. We call it DOR for short. And today we want to reaffirm it as a significant Japanese American community tradition to break the silence, confront and reclaim history, and demand justice. DOR started as a vehicle to honor the Japanese American community's wartime experience and their fight to secure redress from the U.S. government, which led to the passage of the historic Civil Liberties Act of 1988, granting an official government apology and monetary compensation to surviving incarcerees and an educational fund. Today, DOR continues to serve as a powerful vehicle for remembrance, education, and activism, especially for redress and reparations for Japanese American and Japanese Latin American community, which remains ongoing to this day, and other social justice struggles. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge all the sponsoring organizations. This has truly been a campus-wide and a community effort and campus community collaboration, and we're very, very pleased and grateful to have the support of Africana Studies Department at San Francisco State, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Studies, AMED, Asian American Studies at San Francisco State, and community organization Campaign for Justice, Redress Now for Japanese Latin Americans, Comfort Women Justice Coalition, Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE in San Francisco, Eclipse Rising, Edison Uno Institute of Nikkei and Uchinanchu Studies, San Francisco State, Friends of Wadi Fokin, Graduate Theological Union, Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project, and Nikkei Resistors. So thanks to all of you for making this possible. Now, by the end of this class, we hope that you students and everybody else will walk away with a better understanding of the various histories with critical thinking and a lens of social justice, better connect the dots between justice struggles of diverse communities, and finally, be inspired to engage in social justice activism on campus and in your respective communities. Here in the San Francisco State community, the birthplace of the first and only College of Ethnic Studies in the country, the spirit of 1968 lives on. As we embrace DOR, grounded in the principle of indivisibility of justice, we couldn't hope for a better venue. But we do so on the stolen land of the indigenous peoples, the Ohlone people. I'd like to take this opportunity to spread the word about a voluntary tax contribution that non-indigenous people living on traditional Ohlone territory can make to support the Ohlone's rematriation work. And the website is shown on the screen now, but to simply make a donation or to learn more, please visit this website. Finally, you've noticed that we're not using Zoom today, which happens to be the official tool for our university as well. But you may have heard Zoom made an unfortunate choice to exercise censorship over the educational content offered by one of our programs in ethnic studies, purportedly on grounds of giving voice to terrorists. Branding a freedom fighter resisting an illegal and racist colonial occupation of Palestine by Israel, a staunch U.S. ally in the region, as a terrorist is a familiar tactic for many of us, possibly reminiscent of how people of Japanese ancestry were once branded enemy aliens during World War II, or the Arab, Muslim, and South Asian people following the 9/11 attacks. And you'll hear more about this egregious violation of all of our academic freedom from one of our speakers later. But our community's voices shall not be silenced, whether branded as terrorist, prostitutes, enemy aliens, or criminals, or else. Nor our histories be banished into oblivion, forgotten forever. In spite of disruptions and obstacles, we gather here today to reclaim our voice and our narratives and weave them together to see that the struggles discussed today are neither separate nor disparate, but they together offer a shared vision around which we can rally in solidarity to defend our causes, such as these today, and achieve justice across the board tomorrow. Now, we'll open with a short video after this, followed by cultural and ceremonial presentations by our faith leaders to help us get grounded in the theme of DOR and set the tone. Okay. And after that, we have some students just like yourselves sharing their personal narratives about DOR, and then an amazing lineup of speakers from faculty and community. And I know that some of you have been preparing to ask some really great questions in the Q&A section that follows at the end. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So I hope that you take away as much as I'm sure I certainly will. And let's get started. So as I mentioned, the video is going to follow. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to list the amazing folks that will present immediately following the short video presentation, okay? Professors Wesley Weunten and Francis Wong on music, both of Asian American Studies Department, and Reverend Ronald Nakasone, core doctoral faculty of Graduate Theological Union. Zahra Billo, JD, Executive Director of Council on American Islamic Relations, San Francisco, will be presenting. Then Mia Summers, graduate student in Asian American Studies Master's Program at San Francisco State, and Salim Shahide, lecturer at Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies here at San Francisco State, and a graduate student, a PhD candidate at UCLA. And after that, we'll shift to the panels. Enjoy the video. Yes.
Let us not forget the trauma experienced with evacuation, the loss of property, both real and personal, the loss of earnings, the loss of human and civil rights during World War II, the wives and young children left with evacuation decisions because their husbands and fathers were taken away earlier, the deep furrows on the faces of our elderly, on the loss of a lifetime work, the agony of being helpless. I shall never forget the testimony of a mother with two small children, shocked by the action of two military police. While waiting for her husband to return home, they knocked every picture off the wall, threw her Buddhist shrine outside, and smashed it to pieces, tore up all the mattresses. The children were too scared to sleep by themselves. Military necessity, a weak excuse for racism, was never justified. Let us not forget the humiliation and loss of dignity of being herded into Tamparan racetrack, searched like criminals, and furnished a horse stall for what was supposed to be for our protection. Many did not survive psychological stress of confinement and humiliation of being regarded as traitors. Let us not forget the Japanese American men who were reclassified as aliens back in 1942 and denied the opportunity to serve their country. They were later asked to bear arms as the war escalated, and they volunteered from the internment camps to prove their loyalty. Silence will get us nowhere. Our issue is 47 years old. We have been patient long enough. I cannot emphasize strongly enough the urgency to regenerate the same kind of community movement that helped us to win redress. It was through the combined efforts of JACL, NCRR, the veterans, the students, and you in the community. The pressing budget problems of our country is a question of priorities, and we feel redress is a top priority because 200 former internees are passing away every month. Although the budget problems are serious, if they can afford to approve 132 stealth bombers at $530 million each, certainly they can appropriate the amount of 3 bombers to cover reparations for the estimated 60,000 former internees. Hopefully, our country, once admonished for the grave mistake, will never allow this to be repeated again. The freedom of all people will be endangered if the principles of our Constitution are not honored and carried out. We have come this far, hurdled many obstacles. We cannot lose now. It is important that we continue our letter writing campaign, but I feel the time has come when we must become more vocal and rouse the conscience of our country. If you do not fight for your rights, no one will.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wesley Willington. Listening to some music that Professor Francis Wong and I put together as a collaboration. I'm located now in Okinawa. Francis Wong is back in San Francisco. This song is a Okinawan song, and it talks about the displacement of Okinawans after Japan took over or forcibly annexed Okinawa in the late 1800s. The song talks about being forced to leave home to survive. So it's a song about displacement, leaving home and not being able to go home. But the part of the song that hits the heart is there's some hope. So the song talks about leaving home, but then looking at the moon and the nighttime sky and thinking that people past, or remembering people from the past or places in the past, and hoping that people back home and everywhere else are looking at the same moon in the sky at night. So we thought this would be a fitting song for today's event. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Wesley, for that nice rendition. There is always hope, of course. And today I want to begin this portion of the program with what we call in the Buddhist tradition, Bujo. And Bujo is a kind of preface to any service that we have. And we invite the Buddha and all beings, the Buddha from the 10 directions and all beings to be present at this auspicious gathering. After that, I will say a few remarks about my own personal experience in Hawaii, and then in my experience in San Jose when I was assigned to be a minister at the temple there. Bujo Midan Yorai Niudo Jo Sange Raku Bujo Shakal Nyorai Niudo Jo Bujo Jipunyorai Niudo Jo Namo Veda Butsu, Namo. This is the first time I'm participating in the San Francisco State University Day of Remembrance. When I was a minister at San Jose, I participated in many such services. But I understand that the Day of Remembrance is actually on the 19th. That would be tomorrow, I guess. But for us in Hawaii, the attack came, of course, on December the 7th, and December the 8th, the next day, my father and all his siblings were barred from going to their farm. So that is the Day of Remembrance for us. When I had arrived in San Jose, I believe it was 1983, a long time ago, I noticed that the cohort experience of the internees, many of them went to Heart Mountain, I believe it's in Wyoming, and this was the kind of common experience for all of them. But what struck me is not so much their resilience, but the leaders of the temple and the other leaders of the Japanese community understood why they were incarcerated or relocated to these camps. And they concluded that they had no access to power. So with that, they started nurturing young politicians. And Norm Mineta, of course, was one of them. In Hawaii, when the Danny Noi and others returned home to Hawaii, of course, everything was closed to them. So using the GI Bill, they went to school, got their law degrees, and took over the state legislature. And this is the form, or this is the method which Buddhist and the Japanese community fought for justice, racial justice, and minority justice. So that's all I have to say at this time.
We have the director. And now we have Zahra Bilo. Thank you, Zahra.
Of course, my apologies. I was curious about the order. Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace. It always is so heart-wrenching and also uplifting to participate in Day of Remembrance activities. As someone who was coming of age as an American Muslim in the post-9/11 reality, one of my earliest memories as an activist was how quickly the Japanese American community mobilized to support American Muslims and immigrants in the aftermath of those attacks. The message was resounding. We have been here, we have experienced this, we know what comes next, and we will not permit what happened to us to happen to our brothers and sisters. Part of why I enjoy working with the San Francisco State University community is this drive towards the indivisibility of justice. As I experienced it with Japanese American solidarity post 9/11, and as we continue to experience it, building bridges and connections between Black liberation, Palestinian freedom, Indigenous rights, and so many other struggles. I attribute our community's safety, relative safety, in the last 20 years, at least in part, to the courage and selflessness that was demonstrated by Japanese Americans at that time. It is always hard to believe for me, nonetheless, that what happened to Japanese Americans happened mostly on the West Coast, where we today pride ourselves as progressives, as liberals, as open-minded, and as celebrating civil rights. It happened in our lifetimes, less than 100 years ago. And it took many, many decades to get reparations, and even those were partial, not actually reaching all of the people who were impacted by the harms of that era. As a Muslim, I take heed in God's commandment to speak out against injustice. He says, for example, in the Quran, O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice, as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. Follow not the lusts of your heart, lest ye swerve. And if ye distort justice or decline to do justice, verily Allah is well acquainted with all that you do. In our local efforts in recent years, the indivisibility of justice and cross-community solidarity has been so key. We've seen the attacks on Arabs and Muslims, and specifically the AMED program at San Francisco State University. We've seen the hosting of fringe speakers, anti-Muslim speakers, anti-Palestinian speakers, under the guise of dialogue at the Commonwealth Club. And all of this is happening in the backdrop of many people celebrating the ushering in of a new federal government. I leave us with the reminder that we must continue to speak out for justice, and that reflecting on, learning from, and being in community with the Japanese community through their experiences, through their reflections, is how we will move forward. When we say that history can at times be the best predictor of the future, that is the cycle that we are trying to break with this work, so that 75, 80, 100 years from now, we can look back and say, we did the absolute best that we could for everyone, and not just some of us. Thank you.
To share our student perspective.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mia. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm calling from Chochenyo Ohlone land, also known as Oakland. I'm speaking here today as a descendant of incarceration survivors and also the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. So when we think about remembrance, I want to bring in my grandparents who are now quarantining or navigating COVID themselves at home in Berkeley. So my grandmother, my Obachan, was at the age of, I believe, 2 or 3, incarcerated at Heart Mountain. And I learned recently, because of her father's doing no on the loyalty questionnaire, they were sent to Tule Lake. And my Ojichan, my grandfather, he was in Hiroshima, and he witnessed the atomic bombing, and a lot of my family from my grandfather's side passed away in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And so when I think of remembrance, I bring their memory and I bring their experience, and so much of the work I do and why I'm a student in Asian American Studies is wanting to carry on their story. But I also, when I think of remembrance, turn to elders, Ohlone elders like Karina Gold. And she recently spoke about how when we think of prisons, when we think of houselessness, when we think of hunger, that is very new to this land that I'm a settler on, and that the world we are currently living doesn't always have to be isn't always one that will have to be, and isn't one that is inherent to this land. And so we, both as settlers and as Indigenous leaders, can work together to build a better future. And so why I'm here today as a student, as a community organizer, as someone of Japanese American descent whose family experienced the incredible state violence that happened during World War II, is that hoping that in remembrance, we take the time to learn the histories that are uncovered. Because as Sarah mentioned, incarceration, our people resisted. After incarceration, our people continued to organize and demand justice. And even today, they continue to demand justice and wanting to create broad coalitions that not only look at violence happening in our own communities, but also looking at violence that's happening to other communities of color, both located in the United States and beyond. So I hope you, especially the students who are here today, that you continue to use this time to study and learn, and use that to activate your communities and your families towards collective liberation. Thank you all.
Celine,
sorry, I just realized that. Sorry. I just wanted to express my thanks to all the organizers. It's been a wonderful experience working with everybody. I started San Francisco State University in 2015 when I entered my master's program in anthropology, studying Palestinian student organizing. And in that time, I went on to join the General Union of Palestine Students, GOPS, here at State, as well as meet Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Studies Program, AMED. In spring of 2016, I'm just kind of resharing kind of my history with DOR. In spring of 2016 was the first day of remembrance that I ever attended at San Francisco State University. And I've been attending them annually since then. Every year, and for those who don't know me right now, I'm a PhD student at UCLA in anthropology, again, studying Palestinian student organizing, but I also work with the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program in Dr. Abdulhadi in multiple capacities, including with research, including with the classrooms, and including with the ongoing campaigns that we're having to defend the professor and the program and the students from attacks that are coming in, both from undermining by the university and also by Zionist groups who are working to stifle and undermine and really attempt to destroy the program and what we're fighting for. But I did want to talk about one of the things that we do in that capacity in AMED every year with DOR. And every year, Dr. Abdulhadi shows a film titled Enemy Alien. It's a film directed by Conrad Atterer, And the documentary is self-described, it's kind of summary, is a Japanese American filmmaker confronts his own family legacies of World War II incarceration as he joins the fight to free Farouk Abdul Mahdi, a Palestinian-born American activist detained in a post 9/11/2001 sweep of Muslim immigrants. It has been screened many times as part of SFSU's DOR events, including with post-screening discussion panels. Many people here have been on those panels and have seen the film. When I think of DOR, I think of that film and the connections it inspires. It is a reminder that US imperialism and racialization are two sides of the same coin, that the manifestation of social splitting or the creating of an us and an other or an enemy alien is a core tool of the US war machine and of locking people up in prisons, in outdoor cages, in internment camps, in military jails, in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and beyond. Across the 5 years that I've been part of the screenings of this film, students and presenters have discussed the connections to US border militarization, including incarcerating migrants at the border, splitting of families, the wide sweeping Muslim ban, the movement for prison abolition, and Palestinian liberation. It has been a call to push back against government oppression and the failed logic that attempts to rationalize that oppression. There have been large-scale protests, rallies, and political campaigns waged around this at federal buildings, ICE detention centers, city halls, airports, university campuses, all with "never again" for anyone as a rallying cry. And I think I remember that vividly at the San Francisco International Airport when it was more iterations of the Muslim ban were coming through, and there was hundreds, thousands of people at the San Francisco International Airport demanding a seizure of that, a stopping of the Muslim ban and letting people free and letting people go. And "never again" for anyone was on one of three of those posters. In that way, the core organizers here operate with the understanding that DOR, Day of Remembrance, is not only for Japanese and Japanese American people. DOR is for all of us because we continue to fight those struggles. And so I wanted to thank everybody here, thank the organizers, and I think I will give it back to you, Miho, because I know that we're moving forward with the presentations.
Thank you so much. You know, it's just so wonderful to have this lineup and diverse, perspectives and voices being shared. I hope that all of you by now are feeling grounded in this theme. And I would like to, reaffirm that the prayer and the messages that were just shared will surely stay in our hearts long after this program and continue to inspire us. So thank you. And now as we prepare to open up our minds and hearts to the panelists and their words, let us just remember that today we're in the midst of an unprecedented turmoil exacerbated by racial and ethnic hate, anti-democratic attacks, and dehumanization of the poor, and more, all a part of the entrenchment of white supremacy and U.S. empire and its violent assertion of the dominant status quo. And this is also true on a global scale. But it's also a sign that the efforts to subvert this business as usual is striking a chord in a big way. So some of the questions here have to do with exploring that silver lining that I think many of us are seeing here. What are the lessons, insights, and inspiration can we and should we draw from the histories of struggle, the legacies that we're here to inherit? And how do we harness the force for a bold, transformative change now that are emerging before us? And to that end, what does solidarity look like for you and for me and for all of us? These are the kind of questions that I hope will be addressed and that you'll be able to walk away from with clarity in addition to many other insights. So first, to start us off in the panel is Grace Shimizu, who is the Executive Director of the Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project and Campaign for Justice, Redress Now for Japanese Latin Americans. She's with the Comfort Women Justice Coalition as well. Thanks, Grace. Take it away.
Oh, sorry, like this.
You want me to hold it?
Yeah, would you? So, good morning, everyone. My name is Grace Shimizu. I'm a Japanese American whose grandfather and close relatives were incarcerated during World War II in the U.S. concentration camps run by the War Relocation Authority, including Amache, Colorado, Hart Mountain, Wyoming, Jerome, Arkansas, and Tule Lake, California. I'm also the daughter of a Japanese immigrant to Peru who during World War II endured the U.S. Latin American rendition program. While many have learned about the incarceration of U.S. citizens and immigrants of Japanese ancestry, my father's experience is part of World War II history, which has been suppressed, marginalized, and erased. Under this World War II version of U.S. extraordinary rendition, over 6,000 so-called potentially dangerous enemy aliens of Japanese, German, Italian, and Jewish ancestry were abducted from 18 Latin American countries for use as hostages in exchange for U.S. citizens caught in the war zones of the Far East and Europe. Of these, over 2,200 were men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry, both Japanese nationals and citizens from 13 Latin American countries. My father and his first wife, his brother and sister-in-law, and their children were seized from their home in Peru, transported over international borders, classified as illegal aliens upon entry into the U.S., and interned in the Department of Justice concentration camp at Crystal City, Texas, without charge and for indefinite duration. My father's first wife died in the camp due to the trauma of this ordeal and lack of adequate medical care. His younger cousin was interned in the Santa Fe, New Mexico camp and used in the second hostage exchange. At war's end, my uncle and his family were denied return to Peru and were deported to war-devastated Japan under U.S. military occupation. They managed to reunite with my grandmother and other family members in Hiroshima, surviving in the aftermath of the atomic bombing. My father was released on parole from camp under the sponsorship of Japanese American relatives living in Northern California. His hope was to reunite with family members remaining in Peru, but never did so. He eventually remarried and started a family with my mother in Berkeley, California. In the 1950s, with changes in the immigration laws, he was allowed to change his status from illegal alien to legal permanent resident. I serve as the director of the Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project and the Campaign for Justice. In addition to our work to document and preserve the wartime history of our families and to educate the public, we have been waging a struggle for justice for over 3/4 of a century, beginning in the concentration camps to hold the Geneva Convention and its protections of civilians during wartime. We pursued 5 lawsuits and 2 pieces of failed legislation, but the U.S. government has persistently denied redress for the human rights violations perpetrated against our families. So we took our case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which serves as the venue of last resort for redress of human rights violations in the Americas. In 2020, this commission published its groundbreaking decision that the U.S. government owes meaningful material and moral redress to the Japanese Latin Americans for long-standing violations of human rights. It underscored that the principles of equality before the law, equal protection, and non-discrimination are among the most basic human rights, and that equal protection of the law applies to nationals and aliens alike. The U.S. government has the duty to uphold our right to redress and an obligation to provide redress and reparations for wrongs that have occurred, even if they occurred a long, long time in the past. We are now in a new stage of our justice struggle. We invite you to sign our petition calling on President Biden and his administration to comply with the commission decision and to meet with the Japanese Latin Americans to secure proper reparations. We also ask that you help spread the word and encourage your friends and family to sign our petition. We welcome you to volunteer with us, and we could really benefit from your energy, skills, and brain power. So for more information, please just go to our Campaign for Justice website and our Facebook page. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Next, we have, we were going to have Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi, Director and Senior Scholar, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State. She's also one of the key co-organizers of this event. However, due to extraneous circumstances, she's unable to join us, and our spirits are with her and hers with us. But we're very fortunate to have Lubna Kutami, Professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA, an alum of San Francisco State, of AMED, and also General Union of Palestine Students. And she's one of our own. And thank you so much for stepping in to share a few words with us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I have very large shoes to fill for Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi. She couldn't be here today. But I am hopefully will do justice to the work that she's been doing at SFSU in the cultivation of the AMED program and her lifetime work of social justice organizing and activism. So I want to just start off by acknowledging that SFSU is on Ohlone land and acknowledge the Day of Remembrance and Black History Month, and start by kind of speaking about the politics of commemoration. The politics of commemoration carries with it profound importance for the world we live in the present. Certainly, as the Day of Remembrance teaches us, it is critical to address truth, to redress injury and repair harm to such an extent possible. As we have all commonly heard, history is written by the victor. Thus, white supremacist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal accounts of history still dominate institutional knowledge centers of the world today. But to return to moments in time and narratives that have been buried or sidelined to the margins allows for a reconstruction of the knowledge registrars through which we can more adequately make sense of the current world and how we are moving within it. Such commemoration requires centering truth of oppressed peoples as a starting point, the great pain they have experienced, the tremendous courage and sacrifice they have demonstrated in the face of unabated exploitation, containment, ethnic cleansing, racist state violence, and xenophobia, and the profound lessons from disciplined political organizing against systemic oppression throughout history. As Arab and Muslim communities in the US today, commemorating the Day of Remembrance or Black History Month is important because we recognize our struggles for racial and social justice and experience of racialized anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Palestinian racism as deeply tethered to the technologies, logics, and policies that have facilitated subjugation, violence, oppression, exploitation, and exclusion of other communities. First, we turn to the racialized surveillance projects of criminalizing political dissent, rendition, especially that spurred after September 11, 2001. The Bush administration's NSEERS project, or special registration, and the Patriot Act, through the Obama administration's creation of the Countering Violent Extremism Initiative or program, all the way through the Trump administration's executive order declaring the Muslim ban. All of these things and much more was only ever made possible through decades of suppression of our Arab and Muslim communities prior to 9/11. The Nixon administration's Operation Boulder, which secretly spied on scores of Arab organizers, especially students, through the Reagan and Bush senior administration's Operation Vulgar Betrayal, which also implemented secret spying on scores of community activists in Chicago, all the way through the Clinton administration's adoption of new counterterrorism legislation, which further demonized our communities and public racist imaginations. However, even these histories of racialized surveillance and repression are linked to historic and transnational factors. First, the United States' history of settler colonial white supremacy, genocidal campaigns waged against indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, exploitation of immigrant peoples, and the regulation of rights-bearing citizenship, specifically for free white persons in accordance with the 1790 Naturalization Act onward. All of this constructed the legal and cultural domains for othering and rubrics for belonging being tethered to whiteness. Such history of racialized violence and exclusion has taken different forms throughout our history. Anti-Asian sentiment through the 1798 Enemy Alien Act, all the way through the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, all the way through the 1917 wartime immigration reform policies. These demonstrate that Trump's 2017 Muslim ban was not a departure from, but consistent with the history of state racialized violence in this country. And more so, it laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the internment, containment, and racialized oppression of our Japanese siblings during World War II, and that we are commemorating here today. Such processes were also tethered to the historical processes of developing anti-Black and Indigenous surveillance state, from the early slave codes through the project of COINTELPRO, which decimated, or at least attempted to decimate, radical racial justice movements, particularly annihilating scores of Black power leadership. Second, we understand our racialization as Arab and Muslim communities here in the US not only hinged on the history of the US as a racial settler colonial enterprise, but also as a result of its imperialist role overseas. For instance, the development of US imperialist economic and political interests in the Arab region consolidated its support for Israel after 1967 and funding political, economic, and military to reactionary Arab regimes that were bent on suppressing the anti-colonial Palestinian and Arab movements during the 1960s onward. Therefore, as we recognize the historical and transnational configurations of our racialized experience, it is incumbent upon all of us to understand the importance of critical scholarship and pedagogy that can allow us to make these links. The Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program, which I'm happy to be an alum of, recognizes the intertwined histories of subjugation and oppression that has allowed for decades of joint struggle building between oppressed communities, as Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi, the senior director of AMED's work, demonstrates. AMED thus is a pedagogical opportunity, AMED and ethnic studies more broadly, a pedagogical opportunity to redress harm and injury inflicted upon Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and people of color, to link theory and practice for a guiding praxis of social transformation in our schools, universities, and communities, to link self-determined expressions of experience and aspirations for liberation between communities in struggle, and to understand the linkages between ideologies and systems of oppression, ultimately to understand the conditions of possibility that verified the power of settler colonial white supremacy here and linkages to imperialism overseas. Thus, it is of no surprise why then the Palestinian struggle for liberation is an important pedagogical opportunity to revisit these histories of oppression for all communities. And it remains a cause mobilizing worldwide solidarity, just as Dr. Abdelhadi regularly calls for, and as Zahra Bilo has reiterated today, our struggle for justice is and always must be indivisible.
Thank you so much. I just want to particularly express thanks to Lubna and the next speaker for stepping in at really past the 11th hour. We also had Professor Abul Pitreb, Chair of Africana Studies at San Francisco State University, who, due to extraneous circumstances, are unable to join us this morning. However, we're very, very fortunate to have another alum of San Francisco State. Yeah. Terry Collins of San Francisco State Black Student Union and a Third World Liberation Front of 1968 to 1969. Student strikes, 1969 student strikes, and currently he's president of KPOO Radio, the oldest Black-owned community radio station in San Francisco and the West Coast. Terry, take it away.
I didn't expect to be speaking, but the sisters before me, Lubna, she definitely ran down basically what we stood for 50 years ago. The BSU basically was an internationalist organization. When you walked into a BSU office, you saw the National Liberation Front flag of Vietnam there. So we considered ourselves internationalists. When we created the Third World Liberation Front, helped create that, basically we was looking at our struggle because it's connected to the struggles of the world. And for example, what we felt the ethnic studies should be, we didn't call it that, we call it third world studies. I mean, it was changed ethnic studies. Our concept is third world studies. And when we created third world studies, right, a lot of us, for example, who felt that theory was there at state, we learned theory, practices in the community. So therefore, we felt that the only reason why we were there was to be able to take what we've learned on theory and put it into practice. And in the community, for example, as you probably have know that if the community was not with us during that period, that 5 months, almost 5 months of struggle, in which we was going up against intense repression from a newly created tax squad, right? If the community wasn't with us, for example, we had been in deep trouble. They saved our lives. But the problem is, in my opinion, what we fought for is not taking place. The only class right now, the only thing right now I feel in San Francisco State is what we felt like was AMED. AMED is represented what, in my opinion, what we was fighting for. And right now, as you know, they not even ever since she was recruited there, Dr. Rabadi, ever since she's recruited there, she has not been able to fulfill what we fought for. So basically, I don't have too much more to say, but it's basically is that, in my opinion, there needs to be a real struggle within state college or all these colleges, basically, because education in this country is not, you've never been educated. If you don't deal with our history, if you don't, if historical and dialectical materialism is not dealt with in our classrooms, from K to all the way to 12, for example, I mean, there's no education. We are poorly educated in this country, from K-12 all the way up to the universities. But the universities are controlled right now, in my opinion, by corporations. That's why they keep us. They try to this struggle right now that AMED is going through, because they refuse to let people really understand our history. Right now, for example, what's happening in Oakland with elderly people being attacked, Asian elderly people being attacked by youngsters who don't have no education, who don't even know about the question of elders being the ones who tell the stories, who are the ones who basically are so important to our survival, because our economic situation is so terrifying that we got youngsters right now, in my opinion, that haven't been taught or educated. And right now we have prisoners, elders in prison who could be able to come out and be able to deal with these youngsters. And they're kept in prison because they're considered a threat, because they're black, brown, or poor white, and educated themselves through the struggle from their time in prison.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, so again, I think from our speakers, we're already getting a sense of just the importance of listening to the truth and learning correct history so that we can draw proper lessons to move forward, right? Next, we have our own faculty, Dr. Kamomi Kinokawa, who's a faculty lecturer, Department of Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State University, also founding member of Comfort Women Justice Coalition and Eclipse Rising.
Hello. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm speaking here on Ohlone people's stolen lands. And I also would like to thank our Nikkei leaders who generously, forgivingly, and courageously created space for all of us to join their sacred day of remembrance, so we can learn from them what it really means to refuse to forget and to live with resolve never again. Last night, I also was wondering how I got so privileged to end up taking part in this webinar. And I realized that during past several years, I was guided by great revolutionaries that I met through my activism and teaching in the Bay Area, I followed those revolutionaries' intersecting paths and their call for indivisibility of justice that connects like Japanese American, Japanese Latin American redress movement, so-called Call for Women justice movement, Zionist Korean movement, and Palestine, Arab, and Muslim liberation movement at SFSU, CSU, and beyond. I wanted to name everyone, but I just, for the sake of the time, I skip. And then so those revolutionaries all taught me how to set our own narratives, borrowing Dr. Abdul Hadi's words, in face of violence, in face of violent silencing and distortion of historical truth by colonial states, including Zionist, Israel, etc. colonialism in Palestine, white supremacist US, etc. colonialism, and far-right Japanese government's fascist denialism. And last night, while I was thinking about those revolutionaries' work, that actually includes the Lee Yeon-soo, activist and survivor of the Japanese military sexual slavery system, Professor Rabab Abdul-Hadi, Dr. Grace Shimizu, Professor Miho Kim, and many others whom I have worked with, and Nikkei heroes like Yuri Kochiyama, Diane Fujino, all these revolutionaries, if I may say, all taught me how to set our own, all taught me, significance of abolitionist vision. And I'd like to quote the Dr. Alexis Pauline Gump's article that I read with students in my classes earlier this semester, titled "Sometimes Freedom Meant You Have to Burn It Down, Harriet Tubman and an Abolitionist Vision That Don't Quit." And Dr. Gump stated, freedom didn't come from the outside. It came from those immediately and recently inside the trap of slavery. And she continued that, may we not for a second forget that the people currently locked in prison in the United States are among the most powerful people on the planet because they have the insights and potential to make prisons impossible. And so it's the abolitionist vision that don't quit that runs through work by all these the revolutionaries that I mentioned above, and like Yuri Kochiyama's work with correspondences with the political and politicized prisoners, Lee Yeon-soo's work to continue to demand apology from Japanese government all through these years. And then I'd like to also especially mention Dr. Abdul Hadi's work that has taught us about revolutionary feminist narrative of resistance rooted in Palestine women's daily resistance against Israel's violent colonial occupation. And like Yuri Kochiyama, Dr. Abdul Hadi builds archives of their decolonial and abolitionist narratives against colonial forces of silencing, and colonial and far-right states violently condemn those abolitionist narratives because those narratives being rooted in collective acting by all means necessary for justice with immense personal sacrifices are deemed most threatening to those states. So I wanted to talk about the censorship that were mentioned in the beginning that we experienced, but since we don't have time, I just want to say that in face of continuing and intensifying Zionist pressure on our campus, ethnic studies and women and gender studies that were founded in spirit of 1968 must recommit ourselves to producing abolitionist narratives rather than censoring those abolitionist visions as threats to their allegedly underfunded, precarious existence in neoliberal universities. And despite, as my colleagues already talked about, despite being under massive attack, it is AMED, along with their allies, that have been leading the fight to reawaken the spirit of 1968 and to re-radicalize our critical race studies and feminist work against neoliberal revisionism at CSU and elsewhere. So with their massive work and immense personal sacrifices, they continue to produce abolitionist knowledge for all of us. So on this day of remembrance, For our collective abolitionist future, we must be resolved to follow their leadership. So I quit there.
Thank you so much. And now we have final speaker, Reverend Michael Yoshi, co-chair, Friends of Wadi Fokin.
Thank you, Miho. I want to thank the instructors who are convening the classes today for a day of remembrance for inviting me to join you in this time of commemoration and reflection, and also for the students for being here today. My name is Michael Yoshi. I'm a United Methodist clergy and Japanese American. I bring you greetings from Alameda, where I live, where we just renamed the Andrew Jackson Park to Chochenyo Park by action of the City Council last month. And so we want to again honor and remember Chochenyo here in this land and also the Ohlone in the region. I want to just share some thoughts as a clergy and Japanese American on this day of commemoration. I want to thank Reverend Nakasone and Zarabillo for invoking spirit from your Buddhist and Muslim traditions, and also invoke spirit from my own tradition as well, as remember the people who were part of the mass incarceration in 1942. As we remember that executive order in February 19th, my own family was incarcerated on my father's side in Topaz, Utah. They were in Oakland, California, where they lost their restaurant, never to recover that again. My mother's family was in Fresno, California, where they had a farm. They lost their farm as well and never recovered. They were sent to Jerome, Arkansas. This year, to me, it's an interesting anniversary as well, because it is the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Congressional Commission that was created through the reparations movement. In 1981, I was privileged to testify before the Congressional Commission that was established and was having hearings around the country. And in the San Francisco region, I was able to testify there. And that's a long time ago, 40 years ago. When the Redress movement was started, it was also about 40 years after the whole mass incarceration took place. And I think many people will ask the question, are these just relics of past history? But I think our panel today really demonstrates why there's a continued relevance for our history and how we need to continue to be vigilant about how we interpret that history and in what context we do. Terry said some great words about the history of work at San Francisco State, about the global context, the international struggles that we must understand, and Lubna invoked also the transnational context for us to look at things. And it's interesting when you think about the Commission's report that came out in something called Personal Justice Denied. After they took all the testimonies, they named the 3 reasons for the mass incarceration as wartime hysteria, failed political leadership, and pre-existing racism. These were the reasons why incarceration took place. And it's important for us to then understand how those dynamics were at play then, but how those dynamics continue to be at play around issues that we look at today in terms of our transnational context. It's important for us to also understand that the Civil Liberties Act was not just for Japanese Americans, but for all Americans. It gave America the opportunity to apologize for the wrongdoing that was on the part of our own government, and then to rectify that through reparations. Like all legislation, however, there were compromises. And we know now that Japanese Latin Americans were excluded from that bill, and that's why one of the key pieces of unfinished business that needs to continue to go on is what we've heard from Grace Shimizu today for the Japanese Latin American campaign for full redress for themselves. It's also important for us to understand in our context today that reparations for Japanese Americans would not have happened if it were not for the existence of the civil rights movement that was led by Black Americans. And so another piece of unfinished business today is reparations for Black Americans. Just yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing for H.R. 40, the proposed legislation to establish a commission similar to that established for Japanese reparations in 1981. And there were 300 letters of endorsement sent to the committee from Japanese Americans and Japanese Latin Americans endorsing HR 40. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Japanese community was among the first to come to support the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities as they faced unjust infiltration, surveillance, and deportation as we invoked the principles of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And Zara Billu shared her own testimony to having been on that side of the relationship building that took place then, and many in the Japanese community continue the solidarity today and through the recent issuance of Muslim bans under the previous administration. And Lubna has shared around the whole surveillance projects that continues to go on that we need to be vigilant about as well. We cherish these relationships and continue to build these alliances today. Japanese Americans and Japanese Latin Americans were what we might call collateral damage in the context of war. And so it has been important to also address others who've been collateral damage. And that's why it's been significant for Japanese American community to acknowledge and support the comfort women in their quest for justice and historic recognition, as Tomomi has brought up, because we were not the only ones who were caught in the machinations of war during World War II. And just as instructor Wesley Wenton has brought up the plight of Okinawans, the Okinawans as well need to have space for their voice to be heard on an international platform. Today, we're seeing the demonization of China in reaction to the pandemic, but also as an economic threat. And so we're witnessing the collateral damage of the anti-Asian hate incidents that have been proliferating in recent years and are having to deal with that now in the on the ground level in our communities. And following 9/11, I'd like to point out as well that the US declared war on terrorism, and the Philippines was engaged as a key Asian partner in this war. And this has led to the targeting of human rights activists from labor, legal, educational, media, and faith communities. We've had a clergy who've been killed because of their activism for human rights in the Philippines. These extrajudicial killings have spiked and continue to accelerate under the current administration there. And finally, the significant part of the reparations movement was the opportunity for collective truth-telling about our experiences. And that experience of having that platform for our story to be told and a collective narrative to be woven in a place where our story had not been told before is so important, because we're sensitive now to the stories of others whose narratives are being suppressed and censored. The AMED program, which is the key co-sponsor of today's Remembrance, is emblematic of the suppression and censoring of the Palestinian narrative around the world, but especially in this country. And AMED, like other college campuses where significant academic work and Palestinian activism is being cultivated, are subject to harassment, intimidation, suppression, and censorship. So it's so important for us in the Japanese American community to continue that solidarity for Palestinian liberation, but also be aware of how that occupation is present in our own spaces in our own country here today. I just close with the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who reminded us what we're doing here today, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Michael. It was a really powerful and appropriate summation, I think, of all the insights that were shared, and thank you for that. I am aware that it's 10:45 Pacific time, and for many of you, class time is now over, and my apologies for, having to go over. What I would like to suggest is, for those of you who have to sign off, please type in your comments and questions, because we will take the opportunity to, try to find a way to engage in like replies. And this video, by the way, will be recorded and be kept online, hopefully in perpetuity, in several of the platforms that we're using now. So check back with us on the comments, and also we'll record the entire thing and the responses as we're going to continue to speak now for a few minutes. And so you can always come back to check out the last few minutes of the recording. Okay. So why don't we continue and shift onto if there are any questions or comments that folks would like to share from the audience. We are all looking at the comments here that are being posted. And we're seeing a lot of comments, how inspiring all of the speakers have been. And I'm really glad to hear that. And I can't agree more. I'll just give you guys a few minutes. Is there a question? Is there any question or comment from the audience at this point? I do have a message from Professor Gamble's class, Asian American Studies 106, that everyone appreciates the presenters and their stories. I know that for me personally, I always appreciate it when there is a lot of, intellectual stimulation and also a lot of stories grounded in personal firsthand experience. And as it's been, repeated, being grounded in the truth of our own experiences. That's really central to the space that we wanted to create for our commemoration. I have a post here by Daniel Chang. It is so commonly forgotten about the stories of our ancestors. Indeed. Today we heard some. Do you have any other stories that you will always remember? Well, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I do think that, many of us are so hungry to hear, stories. I don't know if anybody wants to share like one additional thing. You can unmute yourself and don't be shy. Do we have any elders in the room or elders in training? Okay, who am I hearing laughing here? Carrie, do you want to share? And I have to stop you probably about 60 seconds because I think we have another comment or a question. But let's aim at 60 seconds or so. If you want to share.
Hey, Miho?
Yep.
I'll share something.
Okay.
My father, who is now 99, is going to be 100 years old this July. And when I was at the church I was serving before I retired last September, there were young people who wanted to take a trip to Topaz because that's where most of the members had been incarcerated. And he wanted to go along with us. And so he came. And so we had folks from young teenagers to, at that time, he was 98 years old. And it was so powerful to have him revisit the site where my family was. And we walked back to the actual place where the barracks were. And he stood there and just, it was an emotional moment for me. I'd been back to Topaz 2 or 3 times, but this one was really impactful. And it was very impactful too because of the young people who were there. So students who are on this broadcast today, I just really encourage you, when you have those inclinations to want to learn more about your own history, please talk to your family members or elders in your families.
Thank you so much for sharing. And and is that Terry I'm hearing?
Yeah, one of the people that we considered our godmother was Yuri Kochiyama. And she lived in 135th in the projects in New York, in Harlem. And she was our godmother, Yuri Kochiyama. So I think everybody should study Yuri Kochiyama.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. This is an opportunity to invoke her never dying spirit And we have to remember, those of us who are carrying on the baton, we're the vessels through which their legacy will be kept alive, right? To keep the struggle going. So thank you so much for the inspiration. Another question we have is, how long has Day of Remembrance been celebrated for?
Since the late 1970s, I think.
Since the late 1970s?
Mm-hmm.
And we hope it'll go for another 70 and more years, huh? So the next question is, do you think the Day of Remembrance can become a national holiday?
Why not?
Grace?
Sure, why not? But you know, I think that we should preserve what the history of why and the context from which Day of Remembrance arises, which is a community remembrance, community education, and community activism for social justice, and particularly the struggle to hold the government accountable for its wrongdoings and the call for reparations.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it happened in the early 70s or through today, we should keep that at the center of what Day of Remembrance should be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like people were saying, Day of Remembrance should not just be confined to the Japanese American community, but embraced by the nation as a whole.
Thank you so much, Grace.
I think there were some discussions around that I remember being in a meeting where people were talking about that, but it was prior to COVID, and I haven't heard anything since.
You know, it makes sense though, Reverend Michael, you had mentioned that, you know, reparations is actually an opportunity for the entire nation. Therefore, every single American has been, you know, given the opportunity to participate in repairing the harm that was done in the name of all of us, right? Or all of the Americans by the government. And so in that sense, it certainly behooves the question of, you know, the relevance, I think, for nationalizing, you know, this holiday. Thank you so much for all those questions. The final one is, how long has DOR been celebrated on the San Francisco State campus? Does anybody know from San Francisco State? I'm not sure that we have anybody who actually knows when it started.
I don't remember. I think it might be about 4 or 5 years.
That's all.
Originally, before pandemic, we had at least part of the DR held in the Garden of Remembrance in San Francisco State. So San Francisco State students, you can go to the Garden of Remembrance, and there's a plaque there. I think many San Francisco State students don't know that there's a Garden of Remembrance that commemorates, I think it was 19 San Francisco State students who were incarcerated. So they had to cut their education short, the college education short. So San Francisco State students try to check out the Garden of Remembrance.
Thank you so much, Professor Wesley. You know, I'm looking at the time, and I would like to use this opportunity to again thank everyone who you know, helped make this venue possible. It was a place of you know, really dynamic and enormous learning, and feeling connected, and to really be inspired as we walk away and continue with our day and our survival. So I wish everyone the best. And again, a reminder to all the students and anybody else, this program is going to be recorded. And so we encourage you to come back and check out the recording. And also, if there are other opportunities to play back the recording in other classes and such in the future, that we encourage you to do so. And you can get a hold of any of us through the website or the San Francisco State University, AMED or Asian American Studies. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining once again. This was San Francisco State University DOR 2021.